The wind howled like a grieving spirit, slicing through the skeletal trees of the Dakota plains, where snow buried the world in a merciless shroud. Mary Whitaker's breath clouded in front of her frostbitten face, her wrists raw and bleeding beneath the iron chains that bound her to the gnarled oak. She was a widow, a mother, a settler who had dared to hope for a new life on the frontier, now abandoned to die in the heart of winter. Her thin shawl offered no defense against the cold, and her thoughts flickered between despair and the fading memory of her daughter's laughter. How had it come to this? The answer lay in greed, betrayal, and the cruelty of men who saw her as less than human. But as her strength waned and the world dimmed, a shadow moved through the blizzard, a Lakota warrior, his eyes sharp with purpose, his heart carrying a story of his own. This is the tale of how their paths crossed, a story of survival, redemption, and the fragile bonds that can form in the harshest of winters. Mary Whitaker had come to the Dakota Territory 2 years prior, in 1878, with her husband, Thomas, and their 6-year-old daughter, Eliza. They were part of a small wagon train seeking fertile land to claim under the Homestead Act. Thomas was a dreamer, a man with calloused hands and a heart full of optimism, promising Mary a future where they'd build a home, grow crops, and watch Eliza grow strong. But the frontier was unforgiving. A fever took Thomas in their first winter, leaving Mary and Eliza to fend for themselves on a half-built homestead. Mary, at 32, was no stranger to hardship. She'd grown up on a struggling farm in Ohio, but the loneliness of the plains gnawed at her. Still, she pressed on, planting crops, tending their 2 cows, and teaching Eliza to read by candlelight. The settlers in the nearby town of Willow Creek were kind at first, sharing supplies and offering help. But kindness, Mary learned, often came with a price. The trouble began with Amos Crane, a wealthy rancher who controlled much of the land around Willow Creek. Amos had a reputation for buying out struggling homesteaders, often at a fraction of their land's worth. When Mary refused his offer to sell her claim, his smile turned cold. "You'll regret this, widow," he'd said, his voice laced with menace. Mary didn't trust him, but she underestimated his ruthlessness. Weeks later, her barn was burned to the ground, her crops trampled. Whispers in town pointed to Amos's hired men, but no one dared speak against him. Mary rebuilt what she could, her hands blistered, her heart heavy with fear for Eliza. Then, one bitter December night, Amos's men came for her. They dragged Mary from her cabin, leaving Eliza trembling under the bed. "You should have sold," one of them growled as they chained her to a tree a mile from her home, far from any path. The iron bit into her wrists, and the cold seeped into her bones. They left her there, expecting the winter to finish what they'd started. Mary's only thought was Eliza, her daughter, alone, defenseless. She prayed, her voice hoarse, her tears freezing on her cheeks. Hours passed, then days. Her strength faded, her mind slipping into a haze of cold and hunger. She didn't know how long she'd been there when she heard the crunch of boots on snow. Takahe, a Lakota warrior, moved silently through the storm. At 28, he was a man caught between worlds. The Lakota had been forced onto reservations, their way of life eroded by treaties and soldiers. Takahe had fought in skirmishes against settlers, his heart torn between anger at the encroachment on his people's land and a quiet hope for peace. He'd lost his younger sister, Whitaker, to smallpox brought by settlers, and the grief had hardened him. Yet, his mother's teachings lingered. Compassion, she'd said, was the truest strength. Takahe was scouting for game, his bow slung across his back, when he saw the figure slumped against the tree. At first, he thought it was a trap, a trick by soldiers or outlaws. But as he drew closer, he saw her pale, shivering, barely alive. Mary's eyes fluttered open as Takahe approached, his silhouette blurred by the snow. Fear gripped her. She'd heard tales of savages who roamed the plains. But his hands were steady, not threatening, as he knelt beside her. "Why are you here?" he asked in halting English, his voice low but clear. Mary could barely speak, her lips cracked, but she managed to whisper, "My daughter." "Eliza, please." Takahe's jaw tightened. He knew the settlers' cruelty. His people had suffered it too. He worked quickly, using his stone to break the rusted chain, his fingers brushing her raw skin. Mary collapsed, too weak to stand, and Takahe caught her, wrapping her in his buffalo robe. "You will not die today," he said, more to himself than to her. Takahe carried Mary to his camp, a small shelter hidden in a ravine. His cousin, Chayton, was there, tending a fire. Chayton was wary, his eyes narrowing at the sight of a white woman. Why bring her here? He asked in Lakota. She's one of them. Takahe didn't answer at first, his gaze fixed on Mary's trembling form. She's a mother, he said finally. Her child needs her. They gave Mary broth and warmed her by the fire, though Chayton muttered about the risk. Mary's strength returned slowly, and with it, her desperation. Eliza, she whispered, clutching Takahe's arm. She's alone. They'll hurt her. Takahe understood her pain. Whitaker's death had left a wound that never healed. He made a choice. I will find her, he promised. The journey to Mary's homestead was treacherous, the storm unrelenting. Takahe moved with purpose, his knowledge of the land guiding him through the blizzard. When he reached the cabin, he found Eliza curled under a blanket, shivering but unharmed. The girl's eyes widened at the sight of him, but she didn't scream. Where's Mama? She asked, her voice small. Takahe knelt to her level. Safe. I'll take you to her. He wrapped Eliza in his cloak and carried her back through the snow, her small hands clinging to him. The reunion at the camp was a flood of tears, Mary sobbing as she held Eliza, whispering apologies, while Takahe watched silently, his heart stirred by their bond. But the danger wasn't over. Amos Crane's men were still out there, and Mary's homestead was no longer safe. Takahe faced a dilemma. His people were wary of settlers, and bringing Mary and Eliza to the reservation could spark conflict. Yet leaving them alone was a death sentence. Chayton argued they should send them to Willow Creek, but Mary shook her head. They'll come for us again, she said. Amos wants the land. Takahe's mind raced. He'd seen too much loss, his sister, his people's way of life. He couldn't turn away from this woman and child, not when he had the power to help. Takahe devised a plan. He and Chayton would escort Mary and Eliza to a neighboring settlement, one beyond Amos's reach, where a missionary couple Mary knew could take them in. The journey would be perilous, crossing open plains where Amos's men could track them. Mary, still weak, insisted on coming, her determination fueled by her love for Eliza. I won't lose her, she told Takahe, her voice fierce despite her frailty. Takahe admired her strength, seeing in her the same resilience his mother had shown. He taught Mary and Eliza how to move quietly, to read the wind for signs of pursuit. Eliza, bright and curious, clung harm. Takahe made a choice. He would confront Amos, not with violence, but with the truth. Under the cover of night, Takahe slipped into Willow Creek, leaving Mary and Eliza hidden in a nearby grove. He found Amos at the saloon, surrounded by his men. Takahe stood tall, his presence drawing every eye. You chained a woman to die, he said, his voice steady, his English clear. Her child was left alone. Is this your honor? The room fell silent. Amos laughed, but it was hollow, his men shifting uneasily. Takahe's words carried weight, and the townsfolk, some of whom had quietly resented Amos's grip, began to murmur. A shopkeeper, emboldened, spoke up. I sought his men near Mary's place that night. The tide turned. Amos's authority crumbled as the townsfolk turned against him, demanding justice. By dawn, Amos was in custody, his men scattered. Mary and Eliza reached the missionary settlement, where they were welcomed with open arms. Mary, her strength returning, vowed to rebuild her life for Eliza's sake. She thanked Takahe with tears in her eyes, offering him a silver locket, Thomas's, the only thing of value she had left. Takahe refused it. Keep it for your daughter, he said. Tell her to be strong, like you. As he turned to leave, Eliza ran to him, hugging his leg. Will you come back? She asked. Takahe smiled, a rare softness in his eyes. If the wind brings me, he said. Takahe returned to his people, carrying the weight of what he'd done. He'd saved a settler, a woman his people might have seen as an enemy, and in doing so, he'd honored his mother's teachings. The plains stretched before him, vast and unforgiving, but for the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. Mary and Eliza, too, carried on, their bond unbreakable, their courage forged in the crucible of winter. The story of the settler widow and the Lakota warrior spread, a whisper of compassion in a land torn by conflict, a reminder that even in the darkest cold, humanity can find a way. For the viewers, and there you have it, a story of survival, courage, and the unexpected bonds that can change everything. Mary and Takahe's tale reminds us that compassion can bridge even the widest divides, that strength isn't just in fighting, but in choosing to help, to understand, to heal. What did you take from their journey? Share your thoughts below, and if this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales that touch the heart. Let's keep the conversation going, because in a world that can feel as cold as a Dakota winter, stories like these remind us of the warmth we can create together.